Think back to Tuesday morning, October 29th, 1929. Across America, millions of people were waking up to what they thought would be an ordinary day. Fathers kissed their wives goodbye. Mothers packed lunches for children heading to school. In offices, from New York to San Francisco, typewriters clattered. Telephone operators connected calls. And on Wall Street, the opening bell would ring in just a few hours. What none of them knew, what they couldn't know, was that by sunset, $14 billion would simply vanish. Life savings, gone. Fortunes, erased. Within 3 years, a quarter of America would be unemployed. Banks would shutter their doors forever. Families would lose everything they'd built across generations. This wasn't just a bad day on Wall Street, it was a chain reaction. Panic, liquidation, bank runs, and economic collapse. It became the most catastrophic financial disaster in American history, contributing to widespread poverty that lasted a decade, causing suicides, starvation, and fundamentally reshaping the relationship between Americans and their government. This was Black Tuesday, the day the music stopped. And for those who lived through it, Tuesday was never the same again. Subscribe and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. I really appreciate it. Thank you. The morning of October the 29th started like the past 1,000 mornings before it, with optimism. 50 million Americans woke to a country that seemed unstoppable. The Great War was over, industry was booming, jazz filled speakeasies, flappers danced, and everyone, it seemed, was getting rich. In Manhattan, a shoe salesman we will call Robert checked his portfolio before breakfast. He would started buying stocks 2 years earlier with money he had saved, then with money he had borrowed. His broker said you could not lose. Everyone was doing it. In just 18 months, Robert had tripled his investment. His wife wanted to buy a house in Queens. Maybe next year, he told her. Let it grow a little more. In Chicago, a widow named Helen had taken her late husband's life insurance payout, $5,000, and given it to her son-in-law to invest. He was smart with money, everyone said. He worked at a bank. He would put it all into Radio Corporation of America stock. RCA was the future. In 5 years, the stock had gone from $85 to $420 per share. Helen's $5,000 had become $25,000. She would never have to worry about money again. In small towns across Ohio, farmers who had struggled through the agricultural depression of the early 20s watched city folk get wealthy and wondered if maybe they should try this stock market thing too. Some did. They mortgaged their land to buy shares. The land had been in their families for 3 generations, but this was different. This was opportunity. What they couldn't know, what nobody could know, was that the entire system was built on air. On margin calls and borrowed money and the unshakable belief that prices could only go up. The market had climbed so high for so long that gravity itself seemed like an outdated concept. But gravity was about to remind everyone it still existed. Here's something most people today don't realize about 1929. There was no Securities and Exchange Commission, no federal deposit insurance, no circuit breakers to halt trading if things got bad. When you wanted to know if your investments were safe, you trusted your broker, and your broker's job was to keep you buying. Most Americans had no idea how fragile the system was. They didn't know that you could buy $1,000 worth of stock with just $100 down, the rest borrowed. They didn't know that banks were using depositors' savings to speculate in the market. They didn't know that the entire boom was fueled by debt piled on debt. A tower of paper reaching toward the sky. But here's what made the situation truly catastrophic. Warning signs had been flashing for months, and the people in charge ignored every single one. In March 1929, the market had stumbled. Briefly, then it recovered and climbed higher. In September, economist Roger Babson warned that sooner or later a crash is coming. The market dropped 3% that day. They called it the Babson break, then bounced back within weeks. See, the optimist said, nothing to worry about. In Britain, the Bank of England had raised interest rates to stop gold from flowing out of the country. That meant less money available for American speculation. In Germany, the economy was wobbling under the weight of war reparations. Across America's heartland, farmers were defaulting on loans because crop prices had collapsed. The foundation was cracking. But on Wall Street, the party rolled on. Thursday, October the 24th. The day it started to break. The opening bell rang at 10 a.m. Within minutes, selling pressure began. Not panic yet, just nervousness, a tremor. But the tremor grew. By 11 a.m., prices were dropping fast. By noon, the volume of trading had overwhelmed the ticker tape machines. They could not keep up. Investors across the country were making decisions based on prices that were 30, 40, 60 minutes out of date. That's when the real fear set in. If you could not see current prices, you had no idea how much you had lost or how much more you were about to lose. By 12:30 p.m., a crowd had gathered outside the New York Stock Exchange. Thousands of people, silent, staring at the building where their futures were being decided. Police on horseback formed a perimeter. Inside, traders screamed themselves hoarse. The noise, one reporter said, it sounded like a roar from a wounded animal. At 1 p.m., the heads of the biggest banks in America met in an office at 23 Wall Street. J.P. Morgan, Chase, First National. They pooled their money, hundreds of millions of dollars, and sent their representatives onto the trading floor with orders to buy, to stop the panic, to show confidence. It worked, temporarily. Prices stabilized. The market even recovered some losses by the closing bell. Thursday's papers called it the most dramatic day in stock market history and praised the bankers as saviors. Robert the shoe salesman went home that night shaken but hopeful. The banks had stepped in. The smart money had acted. Maybe the worst was over. He was wrong. Friday, October the 25th, was calmer. Saturday, the market was closed. It traded 6 days a week back then. Sunday, families went to church and tried not to think about their portfolios. But Monday, October 28th, the selling resumed. Harder this time, faster. The bankers didn't ride to the rescue. They were trying to save themselves now. Robert received a call from his broker. Margin call. He needed to put up more money to cover his borrowed positions immediately. He didn't have it. His broker would have to sell his shares at whatever price they could get. Robert wasn't alone. Millions of Americans were getting the same call, all of them forced to sell at the same time. Then came Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. Black. Tuesday, the opening bell rang and the bottom fell out. 16.4 million shares traded that day, a record that would stand for 39 years. The ticker tape fell 4 hours behind. Fortunes disappeared in the time it took to walk from your office to the exchange floor. Robert tried calling his broker all morning. The line was busy. Everyone was calling. When he finally got through at 2:00 p.m., he learned he'd been wiped out. Everything gone. Not just his profits, his original investment too, and he still owed money on the margin loans. In 2 hours, he'd gone from planning to buy a house to owing money he didn't have. In Chicago, Helen's son-in-law called her that evening. His voice was shaking. The $25,000, her late husband's life insurance, her security, her future was now worth $3,000. And falling. "Should we sell?" Helen asked. "It's too late," he said. "We should have sold a week ago." Helen was 67 years old. She'd been planning to live on that money. Now she'd have to find work. If anyone would hire a 67-year-old widow in an economy that was starting to collapse. That night, as Americans sat around dinner tables in stunned silence, the numbers were still being calculated. $14 billion in market value gone in a single day. To put that in perspective, that was more than the entire federal budget, more than the United States had spent fighting World War I. But here's what nobody understood yet. This wasn't the bottom. The market would keep falling for 3 more years. By 1932, stocks would lose 89% of their value from the 1929 peak. The crash wasn't the disaster. The crash was just the beginning. What made the Great Depression different from every market crash before or since wasn't just that Tuesday in October. It was what came next, the slow-motion avalanche that buried the entire economy. Because here's what people didn't understand. The stock market wasn't some isolated casino. It was connected to everything, to banks, to businesses, to jobs, to farms, to the global economy. When it collapsed, it pulled everything else down with it. By December 1929, the Bank of the United States, despite its name, a private bank, was in trouble. It had lent heavily to real estate speculators and margin traders. When the market crashed, those loans went bad. On December 11th, depositors lined up outside branches across New York City. They wanted their money. Now, the bank didn't have it. Nobody's money was actually in the bank. It had been lent out, invested, tied up in assets that were now worthless. At 3:30 p.m., the doors closed. 400,000 depositors lost everything. It was the largest bank failure in American history up to that point. It would not be the last, not even close. Here's what happened next and why it matters. When one bank failed, depositors at other banks got nervous. They rushed to withdraw their money, which forced those banks to liquidate assets at fire sale prices, which caused those banks to fail, which caused more panic. It was a death spiral. By 1933, over 9,000 banks had failed. 9,000. Millions of Americans who'd never bought a single share of stock lost their life savings because their bank had gambled with their deposits. Robert, our shoe salesman, was one of them. The bank where he'd kept his remaining savings, $800, money he hadn't invested, money he thought was safe, closed in March 1930. He stood outside with hundreds of others, reading the sign on the locked door. The bank regretted to inform customers that $800 was supposed to cover rent until he found another job. Because he'd lost his job too. The shoe store had closed. Nobody was buying shoes. Across America, nobody was buying anything. By 1930, companies were cutting wages and laying off workers to stay afloat. But when workers lost their jobs, they stopped buying products, which meant companies lost more revenue, which meant more layoffs, another death spiral. US Steel, the largest corporation in America, cut its workforce by 75%. Ford Motor Company laid off 2/3 of its workers, General Electric 40%. The unemployment rate hit 15% in 1931, then 23% in 1932, then 25% in 1933. 1 in 4 American workers couldn't find a job, any job. The stories from those years are almost too painful to catalogue. Men in suits and ties standing in bread lines waiting for soup from charity kitchens. Families evicted from their homes, living in shanty towns made of scrap wood and cardboard. They called them Hoovervilles, after President Hoover, who kept insisting prosperity was just around the corner. Children going to school hungry, so hungry that teachers kept crackers in their desks to feed students who couldn't concentrate. And then there were those who couldn't bear it. In the week after Black Tuesday, suicides spiked. Men jumped from office buildings. One man shot himself in the lobby of a brokerage house. Another left a note that said simply, "Tell the boys I can't pay." But the suicides that haunt history aren't the immediate ones. They're the ones that came later. The father in Philadelphia who turned on the gas after his family was evicted. The farmer in Kansas who walked into his barn and didn't come out. The businessman in Chicago who'd been a millionaire in 1929 and a pauper in 1932. These were proud men who'd believed in the American dream, who'd played by the rules, who'd worked hard, and the system had destroyed them. By 1933, the numbers had reached catastrophic proportions. 25% unemployment, 9,000 bank failures, the stock market down 89%. Industrial production cut in half, International trade down by 2/3 and over 15 million Americans out of work. But here's the question historians still debate. Why did it last so long? Why did it take an entire decade and ultimately a world war to finally end? Part of the answer is that the people in charge made it worse. President Hoover believed in balanced budgets and minimal government intervention. When the economy collapsed, he cut government spending and raised taxes, exactly the wrong response. It was like treating a patient bleeding to death by removing more blood. The Federal Reserve, which could have injected money into the economy, instead tightened credit. Banks that might have survived with help were allowed to fail. But here's the deeper truth. The people in power in 1929 had no framework for understanding what was happening. They'd never seen anything like this before. Classical economic theory said markets were self-correcting. If you just waited, supply and demand would naturally restore equilibrium. They waited, and millions suffered while they waited for a recovery that wasn't coming. In March 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated as president. In his first 100 days, he fundamentally restructured the American economy. He closed all the banks, every single one, for 4 days. He examined their books. Only the solvent ones were allowed to reopen. He created federal deposit insurance so Americans would never again lose their savings in a bank failure. He created the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate the stock market and prevent the kind of speculation that had caused the crash. He launched massive public works programs, the WPA, the CCC, putting millions back to work building roads, bridges, dams, schools. The government became the employer of last resort. The changes went deeper than policy. They changed how Americans thought about government itself. Before the Depression, most Americans believed the government should stay out of economic affairs. After the Depression, they demanded that government protect them from economic disaster. Social security, unemployment insurance, labor protections, bank regulations, all of it emerged from the trauma from 1929 to 1933. The crash created the modern American state, and it created a generation defined by caution. Robert, our shoe salesman, eventually found work with the WPA, then later with a defense contractor when war production ramped up. He never fully trusted the stock market again. For the rest of his life, he kept cash hidden in his house, in books, in the back of closets, under floorboards. Just in case, he wasn't alone. The generation that lived through the Depression became famous for saving everything: rubber bands, aluminum foil, bread bags. They couldn't shake the memory of having nothing, of needing everything. Helen, the widow whose life insurance had evaporated, moved in with her daughter. She lived another 23 years, working as a seamstress until she was 85. She never stopped being angry at her son-in-law, the banker, who'd promised her security and delivered poverty. In her will, she left instructions that her savings, $437, be buried with her. She didn't trust banks. She didn't trust anyone. The Great Depression finally ended in 1941, not because the economy healed, but because America entered World War II and war production put everyone back to work. It took 12 years and a global conflict to undo what had started on that October morning. By then, an entire generation had been scarred. Children who'd grown up hungry, teenagers who'd never had a job, men who'd lost their dignity, women who'd held families together with nothing but will and determination. Ask anyone who was there, the ones still alive, now in their 90s and 100s, and they'll tell you about the fear, the gnawing, constant fear that the next meal might not come, that the landlord would knock on the door, that your children would go to bed hungry. They'll tell you about the shame of standing in breadlines, of taking charity, of failing to provide for your family even though you'd done everything right. They'll tell you about the silence in houses where electricity had been cut off, the cold winters when coal cost too much, the strange emptiness of streets where nobody could afford to go anywhere or buy anything. And they'll tell you about the kindness, the neighbour who shared a pot of beans when they had nothing else, The grocer who let you run a tab he knew you couldn't pay. The strangers in Hoovervilles who made room in their shacks for one more family. They'll tell you that the worst of times brought out the best in some people and the worst in others. 95 years later, the Great Depression has faded from immediate memory. Most Americans alive today never experienced it firsthand. It's history now, black and white photos, statistics in textbooks, a story our grandparents told. But the structures it created, Social Security, bank insurance, securities regulation, the expectation that government will intervene in economic crises, those remain. We live in a world shaped by 1929, and the warning it offers remains urgent that prosperity can be fragile, that systems we trust can fail, that millions of ordinary people can have their lives destroyed by forces they don't understand and can't control. That Tuesday morning in October started with optimism, with fathers kissing their families goodbye, with children heading to school, with millions of people who believed their futures were secure. By nightfall, that world was gone. The Great Depression taught America that the modern economy wasn't self-correcting, that faith in markets wasn't enough, that when the system failed, people needed protection, needed help, needed a government willing to act. Those lessons cost 12 years and countless lives to learn. We'd better not forget them. If your family lived through the Great Depression, if your grandparents told you stories about those impossible years, share them in the comments below, because those stories, those names, those lives, they're the real history, and they're the ones we need to remember most.